Several students asked questions like this. Is there an easy way to check if a value is in a given range? Or if the user types something into a scanner, how can you check to make sure what data type it was? In general, this kind of thing is called input validation because you're trying to check if the user's input is valid according to some criteria that you have. So let's actually start with a really great solution to problem 3 and answer this question by seeing how we could make it even better. So I really like this solution. It's well organized. All the lines of code are grouped in a sensible way. The variables are named well. Windchill is this nice method that's defined on one line down here. I particularly like that this student didn't try and include all of the input validation inside the method, because that tends to clutter up the method with a lot of if statements that make it harder to kind of read and understand. And I'd said that you can assume that the inputs are in the valid range. That was part of the preconditions that I said in the problem. So it's not bad to want to check to make sure, but I think it's nice to do it before you ever run Windchill at all. So put the if statements up here rather than in the method. All right, so let's answer the questions now. If I'm programming by intention, I'm going to invent a method that I wish existed. I wish that I could do something like this. Get double in range, and I give it maybe the message that I want it to display for me, and then I give it the range that I want to check for, so -50 to 50. So this method doesn't exist yet, but the way I'm imagining it working is sort of like the 2 lines of code that I just deleted. This one method is going to display this message, then get a double from the scanner, and then check to make sure it's between those 2 bounds. And if it's not, then we'll display an error message and make the user do it all over again. So that way, by the time the method actually returns a value, it's guaranteed to be in the correct range. So let's pretend that that method exists, as we do. If it did, then this code becomes really kind of short and nice, because this would say get double in range, and then I'd have my message, and then this was 3 to what? Oh, it's right there, 120. Okay. So that's the goal. We want to write a method that does this. So let's go ahead and create the method. S is not a good name because this first parameter is really the display message. So I think I'll type display message here. I is not a good name either. Let's call this min value. I is not a good name because this is max value. So it's important, even if you're auto-generating your methods, to name your parameters something that's meaningful. And what we want to put inside the method is this kind of pattern. We're using the scanner to get a double value from the user, and I didn't write that part, I just wrote this. But we want that to be inside a loop that will keep looping as long as the value that they entered fails whatever test it needs to pass. So for us, it needs to pass the test of being between a min value and a max value. It needs to be inside a valid range. So we'll say do get the value from the user while the value is not in the range, while it fails the test. So that's the general pattern that we want to implement here. So I'll go ahead and type it. Okay, so you can see here I've attempted to implement that pattern. I've got my value. I'm having the keyboard give me the next double that the user types. And I'm continuing to do that while it's not true that the val they type is larger than the min and also less than the max. So while it's not true that it's between those 2 bounds. So while that's not true, we go back and we make them do it again until it is true. All right, so you'll notice one thing is that keyboard is not defined in this scope right here. That's because we defined keyboard up here in main, but that variable doesn't exist inside the method that we just created. So a typical thing you would do is you would pass the object that you need as a parameter, or I guess I should properly say as an argument. So I'll define a parameter here, keyboard, which is a scanner data type. And now these are broken because my method is expecting a keyboard as an input, but I'm not giving it one. So let's give it one up here. And it's pretty normal when you're programming by intention later on to discover that you need more inputs to the method than you had thought that you did when you first created it. So now I create the keyboard once, but then every single time I try and get a double in range, I pass that keyboard object into the method, and then it gets used to ask the user for a double, and then we do the input validation. All right, so I think that's going to work. The problem is when the user doesn't get it right, nothing displays for them. So I think we want to add one more thing, which is if they didn't pass the test and it's about to make them do it over again, we want to tell them what they did wrong. So I just pasted that condition here. So if it's not true that it's in the range, then let's display your number must be between, and then we'll do min and max. All right. Cool, so let's run it and see if it works. So clearly one thing I'm missing is I forgot to have it display the prompt. So let's go back and fix that. So I go to all the trouble of passing the display message in, but then I never actually display it. So let's system.out.println whatever the display message is. Let's run it again. All right, so type temperature in F. So I'm going to do -1000. And then it says your number must be between -50 and 50. And so let's do one that's too large. Okay, so now let's do 32. Great, and now it's moved on to the next question. So that data validation is working. So actually, I guess the original question was, is there a built-in method to do this? And the answer is no. Generally, checking if something is between two boundaries is a simple enough test that they expect that, or the language designers expect that you should just be able to do that yourself. Let's do one more type of validation though, because let's run it again. So if I were not going to type a number, if I was going to type lobster, it would crash. In particular, it throws an exception, and that exception is just a word that means runtime error. And the particular type of error that's happening is called an input mismatch, because the scanner was expecting me to type a double, but actually I typed a string. Java provides a graceful way of handling this type of error, and I'm not going to tell you all about how it works. This is going to be sort of the simplest version that will do what we want. But the general idea is you have two blocks of code, a try block and a catch block. So you'll have the keyword try followed by a curly brace, and then all the lines of code after the curly brace are the lines of code that you want to attempt to run, but you're worried that a particular error might happen. And then if an error does happen, the code will immediately jump execution out of the try block, and it will start to run the code inside catch. If you didn't have your code inside this try catch block, what would happen is it would just crash the way that we saw. But if you do have the code that throws the exception inside the try block, instead of crashing, it will just run whatever code is here. And typically what you might want to do is display some type of error message. So you might notice that I have a pattern here that looks almost like I'm declaring a method. Here inside the parentheses, this looks like I'm declaring parameters. It's got that same pattern where I have two words, and the first one's a data type, and the second one's a variable name. It's like int n, string, name. So that's not an accident. This is very much like a method signature. So what we're doing is we're declaring a variable whose name is myError, and the data type for the variable is a special kind of object called an exception object. And when the code up in your try block causes the exception to happen, all the information about what line of code caused the problem and what kind of problem it was, all of that information gets added to this special exception object. And that exception object gets assigned to this myError variable. And what that means is, down here on the catch block, you can ask that object to tell you about what went wrong. So you could, for example, say println myError.getStackTrace. And StackTrace will tell you the exact line of code that the problem happened on. So let's go ahead and try and use that same idea. Except I'm going to continue programming by intention. Rather than having all the try catch block be here, I'm going to make another method. So I'm going to cut, I guess let's do this. I'm going to cut both those lines. I'm going to say val equals get double. So keyboard display message. So I'm imagining that there's a method called get double, and all it does is it displays this message and has the user type a number, but it checks to make sure that it's actually a double. And if it's not a double, then it'll display an error message and have the user do it again instead of crashing. So I'm going to create, so I'm going to create this method. These are all fine variable names. I'm going to paste that. And now I'm going to put this code inside the try catch block like I just described. So I'm going to say try to do this code, but I'm going to catch a particular exception that might occur. And you've got to import this. So did I misspell it? I did. Okay, well, you might need to import it. Here it says val is not defined, so let's define it here. So if they type something that's not a double, the error is going to happen right here on line 36. And when that happens, execution will immediately jump to line 38. So what that means is it's safe for me to have val be my return value from the method down here, because if they actually type a double and nothing goes wrong, then great. It will just keep going past line 36 and return the right thing. If they type a string that's not a double and it throws an exception, we will never get to line 38 because it will stop right there and immediately jump to line 40 now. So that's why it's safe to have your return value here. And then I am going to say you must type a number. Okay, so here's the problem though. This is definitely going to catch the error if it happens, but I want to go back and have them do it over again. So what that means is I want to use now the same pattern that we used up here with a do while loop. So I'm going to say do all this stuff that I just said. So do all this try catch where we have them type in their number and check to see if it's actually a number. But I'm just going to keep doing it until they get it right. And when they get it right, it's going to exit immediately because of the return statement. So I can say while true. And what it means to put true inside this test condition is this is just going to loop forever. And the thing that's stopping it from looping forever is as soon as the error doesn't happen and we hit the return statement, a return statement immediately exits the method, and so it doesn't have a chance to get to the bottom and loop again. So I think now we have a complete working version. Oh, there's one kind of quirky thing about scanner. So if there was an error that happened here and it goes to the catch block, we need to clear out the return key that you hit after you typed the number, and this line of code will do that. You can think about it as just clearing the scanner so that way when you loop for the next loop, the scanner is empty and you can read in whatever the next double that they'll type will be. All right, so I think that's all going to work now. Let's run it again, see what it looks like. So type a temperature in Fahrenheit, lobster. Okay, you must type a number. No, no, no. I have a 3-year-old. Nope, nope. Okay, so clearly I'll type a number. Let's type 1,000, 10,000. Oh, my number must be in the right range. Back to lobster. Still must be a number. Okay, 30. Great, and now it's moved on to the next question. So you see, depending on how we are giving it the wrong type of input, it's giving us different error messages, and that's happening in different places in our code. It's either happening in the method that's intended to just make sure we're typing a number, or it's happening inside the method that's intended to make sure that the number is inside the correct range. So that might have seemed like a lot of work to go through just to get that sort of comparatively modest output. But the nice part about declaring your own methods is you only have to do it once. Now that you've written this code, you could reuse this same idea in other places if you wanted to. So that's the kind of power of methods. And I don't know if we're going to actually make our own library this year. We might, but you could make your own, for example, input validation library, where you have all of these methods predefined. They're saved in a jar file, and you would include the jar file in your project, and then you could just use them as if this is already a built-in part of Java. So that's a kind of a nice thing. Okay, well, I hope that this has been helpful. I hope that you learned something. Keep your questions coming.